So it finally stopped snowing, and I'm out here scouting for dandelions. I was hoping to find a large field of them, but the most condensed I've seen so far has been under the freeway, which I'm kind of reluctant to use because who knows what sort of nuclear radiation they're growing in. I think I'm too early. So dandelions are great for many things. I won't be eating them because we're in the middle of the city, but I'm going to collect them to make dye because last year I was in Denmark and I bought some yarn from a woman who raised her own sheep and then was dyeing them during this yarn festival. Yes, I found a yarn festival in Denmark by accident. She dyed this yarn green and yellow with dandelions. This is yarn, this is yarn, this is also yarn, this is some more yarn, this is yarn. So this is the yarn that I bought in Denmark. I believe this was like a light gray color before. This is all yarn that I've undone from sweaters, and this is what I'm gonna dye, but I have to choose, and that's hard. It would be interesting to dye some of each. This could turn orange or it could turn dark green, and if it turns dark green, then I'll regret not having dyed all of it. But the problem is I want to see all of the colors. But if I start dyeing willy-nilly, then I'm gonna have trouble making something with what I've dyed. I need to make decisions and stick with them. These plus the hand spun. Okay, enough of that. I'm gonna weigh all this now. For my bookkeeping, I'm going to weigh everything separately and then weigh everything together. 52.7, 378.7. Oh, that went faster than I expected. I can't even decide what soap to use. Let's go with dish detergent. That was horribly scientific. I'm marking these skeins because I'm going to treat them differently. And once they go into the pot, I won't know which one is which because I have 2 of each of these. This is heated to just below a simmer. I have this thermometer in here so I can keep track if it's going to go crazy or not. It's important that I don't boil this because wool felts when it is heated and agitated, which is exactly what boiling does. So while we're waiting for that to be clean, let me explain a few things. Shena from the future, here to explain this a whole lot better than Shena from the kitchen did. Bear with me because there's a lot of explaining to do. At this point, I had a philosophical discussion with myself and I made some executive decisions about how I was going to do this long term. Because there's nothing wrong with chucking stuff into a pot and making pretty colors, which is what I've pretty much been doing for the last year. But I'm of the opinion that I kind of need to know what I'm doing in order to be able to make what I want. Right now, I have no idea what I'm doing, which means it's time for research, not masterpieces. I got pretty overwhelmed by all of the decisions I was having to make here, which I think is totally fair because this is an incredibly complicated process with an insane amount of variables, and it's chemistry. I have to imagine that I took high school chemistry at some point, but I have zero recollection of the class. So I was looking stuff up like, how does a pH scale work and what are heavy metals? Because clearly I've never had a need to retain that sort of info if I even ever learned it in the first place. I'm not even totally sure that a lot of my questions were valid because I'm not even familiar with the basics. There also seem to be a lot of conflicting opinions on how to use natural dyes. It seems like this is in part because it's something that was passed down experientially, which kind of stopped when synthetic dyes were invented around 1856, which was incidentally around the same time that science really started to get going. So probably information was lost at some point. Bearing all of that in mind, I kind of identified 4 different sets of variables that can alter the final result. Number 1, your base materials. That includes the plant you're using and the kind of yarn you're using. Different plants make different colors, and you can also get different colors out of the same plant depending on which part you use. For example, I probably could have gotten a completely different color out of dandelion roots. I just didn't really want to be digging in the field where I found them. When one dyes things, it's usually easiest to measure stuff by the weight in relation to the stuff that you're dyeing. So a higher dye stuff to fiber ratio will probably make a more intense color. And something to keep in mind is that different plants will react differently to different things. So what you do to one doesn't necessarily mean that the same will happen with another. Then there's the color of your yarn in the first place. Obviously, a darker yarn will remain a darker color. You can always make stuff darker, but you can't really make stuff lighter. Now, because I'm using recycled yarn, I wondered if the fact that it's already been dyed once affects its ability to absorb more dye, or if that doesn't matter because I'm using mordant. Then you have the fiber type. Cotton and linen are cellulose fibers, which you treat differently from wool, which is a protein fiber, which you treat differently from silk, which is technically a protein fiber, but kind of its own thing. I'm going to mention scouring here really quickly because that's what's going on back in the kitchen. Basically, you just make stuff really clean so the dye can get in there and doesn't stick to the wrong stuff. It's an important step to do before you do everything else. Number 2, mordants. I would argue that mordants are the most complicated part of this whole thing. Traditionally, mordants have been solutions of dissolved metal oxides. Metal oxides can react with acids to form metal salts, which I think is usually the form that you find mordants in. So what the heck's a mordant? Basically, mordants are there to act like molecular glue. Fiber and dye don't really stick to each other very well, but they will both stick to the metal ion in the mordant. Mordants have a huge impact on color fastness and light fastness, which are basically just fancy words to talk about how well the color stays in the yarn and whether or not it fades over time and with exposure to light. There are a lot of different metal oxides that you can use. For example, copper, tin, iron, chrome. The problem with mordants is that they can be really toxic. I think there might even be laws about some of the chemicals involved, but I didn't even get into that. So any idea you have about natural dyes being inherently vastly better for the environment? Highly subjective and not necessarily true. I'm just doing it because I think it's really magical that plants can make colors and they live in my backyard. For this project, I was using alum potassium sulfate, which is probably the least toxic of all of the mordants and one of the most common. Apart from metal oxides, you can also use tannins. You've probably heard of tannins because they're that taste in wine and unripe fruit. Basically, tannins are compounds that occur naturally in a bunch of different plants. Some dye plants already have tannins in them, which means you don't have to use a mordant with them. And those are called substantive dyes. Fun fact, tannins are called tannins because people originally used them to tan animal hides. Now I know people also used brains to tan animal hides, so I had to look up whether or not brains had tannins. Turns out that brains have lecithin, which is a fat. You've probably heard of soy lecithin, which is an emulsifier, among other things, which means that it keeps the ingredients in your chocolate bar from separating. I have no idea if that makes lecithin a tannin, so if you know something about that, please let me know before I spend all of my time on the internet reading articles about putting brains into blenders. As far as I can tell, tannins are more often and more effectively used for cellulose fibers rather than protein fibers, but it's kind of the Wild West here. People even combine metal oxides and tannins to mordant. Then, there is a difference between a mordant and a fixative. From what I could tell, fixatives work because they alter the pH of the dye bath. Protein fibers absorb dye more easily in an acid bath, whereas cellulose fibers absorb dye more easily in a basic bath. You can also mordant at different points in the process. Most commonly, people do it before they put the things in the dye, but you can also do it during. 3, we finally got to the point where you can actually put your fiber in the dye. There are a couple different variables here. They're fairly straightforward. One is the length of time that you leave stuff in the dye, and you can also manipulate the pH. Some dyes will turn totally different colors depending on if the bath is more acidic or more basic. Some dyes will also lose their color if you heat them above a certain point, so you have to be careful with temperature. You can also add some sort of metal salt into the dye bath itself. You can reuse the dye, which is known as an exhaust bath. That usually just gets you a lighter shade of whatever you had before. Finally, you can alter stuff after you've dyed it. Usually this involves dipping your fiber in some sort of metal oxide. For example, I've dipped yarn in an iron bath before. I was debating heavily about doing that again this time, but iron can be really hard on yarn, and mine always turned out kind of brittle and scratchy. And because it had so many different colors of yarn in the first place, I decided just to do something else. Whew, I think we got through that. Now here's the kicker. Even if you did everything the exact same way that you did it before, you won't necessarily get the exact same results. That's known as dye lots. And even when you buy commercial yarn, you have to buy stuff in the same dye lot. Because if, for example, you run out of yarn before you finish your sweater, and you try and go back and buy more yarn of that color, if it's a different dye lot, it might not necessarily match the yarn that you already have. Okay, let's go back to the kitchen. It's very strange spaghetti. I'm gonna rinse these out, but first I have to wait until they're sort of cooler, because if I'm going to rinse them in cool water, I would shock them right now, and that would felt them, which I don't want. Here we go again. This is the part that I don't like so much, because I end up using so much water. But I think it's interesting to do this because then you think about what the industry uses in terms of water when they dye stuff, and the amounts just must be massive. Alum going in. I was a little bit overzealous in my rinsing, and I gave this one an extra rinse because it's hand spun and therefore it still has lanolin on it, which is basically sheep grease, and it started to felt together. So while I'm waiting for the mordant to be ready, I'm just kind of like separating some stuff. This is mordanted for an hour, so I'm going to let it cool in the mordant overnight. As far as the eye can see. I was gonna pick the dandelions outside my window this morning, but when I went to go to get them, I ended up talking to this guy staring at his window at them, and he seemed to be enjoying them so much that I decided to leave them for him. This is a completely obligatory part of the process. $605.5 grams. Because I can, I'm going to use twice as much dandelions by weight as I have yarn. I would like to apologize to all of the ants that I am about to boil to death. These are the two skeins that I marked before, so I'm going to set them aside to put them in the exhaust bath later. So it looks like it's somewhere between 4 and 5. There's some interesting stuff going on here. I'm going to let this sit overnight in its own juices and see how it is in the morning. It's time to rinse this out. I'm debating how I'm actually going to continue with this experiment. Judging from the intensity, I don't think I'm going to get so much out of the exhaust bath. I'm debating whether I should get more dandelions so that I can try an even higher percentage of dandelions to fiber. But this is already 200%, so that's kind of a lot. I was surprised by how much they cooked down. So in theory, I would have room for a lot more of them. But I'm also debating if I want to try something completely different, because the woman in Denmark that dyed the yarn that I bought, she was mordanting and scouring and dyeing at the same time. So she had like vinegar, salt, and soap in the pot as she was dyeing it. And I could try that too, and I'd be curious what that does to the pH, because like I measured, it's pretty acidic just with the dandelions, and vinegar would make it more acidic, but salt might make it less acidic, so maybe it would like sort of balance each other out. I like the idea of dyeing in one pot because I would theoretically use less water, and it's also a lot less effort because you just do all of the steps at once. But right now I can dispose of my dye in the garden, but as soon as I put salt in something, I don't think I should do that. It's not really the end of the world, I just like to try and waste as little water as possible. Ideally I should be collecting rainwater, but I don't really have a good system to do that here. If I dye this in one pot and the acidity changes, is that going to change the color too? This new yarn is not mordanted, it's not scoured, it's not anything at all. I was doing some research about vinegar and salt, which are fixatives, not mordants. And I was trying to figure out how much to use. I have the feeling that the woman in Denmark kind of just chucked stuff in the pot. I don't know if she really measured, other than having a general idea of what she was doing. What I came across was only the amount of vinegar or salt in relation to the water, and not in relation to the dye stuff, which is kind of hard for me to measure. So I might just end up using an arbitrary amount and noting it down in relation to the amount of fiber that I'm using. They say you should use 4 parts water to 1 part vinegar and 16 parts water to 1 part salt. So in that pot, I'm gonna pitch in vinegar, salt, soap, dandelions, and then chuck this in, heat it all up, and hopefully get a different color. Here goes. It looks like it's a little bit more acidic than the last one, but not by that much. There's a very slight yellowish tinge to it, but nothing like what I should expect for literally 7 times the amount of dandelions as the weight of the fiber. That's actually kind of cool. My molecular glue was working apparently. Here we have the original skein. Here's the skein that I mordanted with alum, let simmer in the dye for 2 hours, and sat overnight at 200% dandelions. Here's the skein that I put in vinegar and salt, let simmer for 4 hours at 700% dandelions. This is fun. More dandelions. I attracted some attention in my dandelion field this morning. The first security guard told me that I could finish what I was doing, but basically skedaddle, this is private property. The second security guard was a jolly fat Italian man, and he just wanted to know what I was doing with the heads of the dandelions, since he's used to eating greens. And when I told him I was making dye, he went, "Oh, we have a whole field, go ahead, take as many as you want." So for this last test, I'm going to dye these 3 skeins at 457% weight of fiber, because that's what I gathered this morning. I'm gonna do it pretty much like I did the first one. So I'll boil these for 2 hours before I throw these in. One of the things I'm dyeing is the hand spun skein that I already dyed. I have a pretty accurate representation of this color already in the other white yarn that I had. And I'm going to just save a little sample of this so that I know what it was before I threw it in again. These are the 2 that I marked and mordanted earlier but didn't use. That's all. Here we go. Oh, one other note. I'm gonna try really hard not to bring this entirely to a boil. Because the other 2 times it ended up boiling because I don't really have a good system to be able to regulate the temperature. But I'm wondering if that affects the color, so I'm gonna keep an eye on it. We'll see if it works. I just made these wet again so that they would absorb the dye more evenly. Geronimo! Rinsing time! I really thought I was done testing after that last round. But I found some skeins that I had already mordanted from a previous project, so I thought, what the heck, I'll try the exhaust bath. And I threw a skein in, and it came out this beautiful sunshiny lemon yellow. Then I was like, what the heck, let's try the iron. So these are just normal iron supplements, and I'm washing the coating off of them. And then I'm going to dissolve them in a special pot that I reserve only for iron. The iron pill has dissolved, and it's turned the water this reddish orangish color. So theoretically I should be doing this with gloves, because iron is not really something you want in direct contact with your skin. I don't have any gloves, so I'm gonna rinse this out like this a couple times before I actually touch it. This here is my newly created dye book. I'm sewing samples of all of the things that I dyed into this. And once I have a lot of them, then I can probably just point to certain colors that I want and know exactly how I made them. I've taken super copious notes about what I just did, and I'm also sewing in samples of what color the yarn was originally so that I know what my base color was. I'm making sure to date all of this so that I can know if the colors fade over time. I didn't take great notes on my projects before, but I did put them in here anyway so that I can at least have what I know. There was one project that I did that I didn't take any notes at all, and that was a shame, and I didn't even keep the yarn. I haven't been showing these on camera for the exclusive reason that it's impossible to get the true color. I think it's also difficult to see some of the subtle differences between the skeins because a lot of them turned out kind of similar. For example, these 2 skeins, one at 200% and one at 457%, aren't really that different in real life, but you definitely can't tell the difference on camera. This one turned such a lovely deep forest green. The green on the bottom right is by far my favorite color of this entire batch. It looks kind of washed out on camera, it's kind of more of a deep olivey green. And the top right is one of the skeins that I dyed using vinegar and salt. Again, there's not much of a difference between the 200% and 457% here. And you can see that the vinegar and salt skein is barely different from the original color at all. This was my hand spun skein. It definitely got a lot more intense after I put it in for the second time. This is just a little scrap of what it used to be. It looks horribly bleached out on camera. I would say this is like neon lemon lime. These were only in the exhaust bath for half an hour each, and the one on the bottom I put in iron for 10 minutes afterwards. I kind of just threw them in one at a time, but I was surprised at how intense they turned out. Now, these were 20-gram skeins in a bath meant for a lot more yarn, so I don't know if that had to do with the intensity, but I think it's worth noting that I shouldn't underestimate the exhaust bath. All of the skeins that I dyed have kind of a greenish cast to them, but I think it's interesting to note that the top one from the exhaust bath that I didn't put in iron is a very clear, pure yellow. So obviously I have some questions about this. Number 1, what the heck happened here? Why could this woman get this beautiful green color and I didn't even get anything at all? To be honest, I'm not really sure I remembered correctly about her having both vinegar and salt in there, or if I was just thinking of salt because I know I've used it with RIT dyes before. And I don't know if it works that way, but if what I was speculating about them kind of canceling each other out in terms of acidity is true, then it might be worth trying again just with vinegar. Number 2, my results are really different from what I remember this woman having. This is the skein that she dyed, and it has a much more bluish cast to it and mine have much more greenish casts to them. I also remember her yellows being closer to this from the exhaust bath than these, which are pretty greenish too. Is it the Danish dandelions? Or is it something to do with the chemical reaction in the mordant? Or was my yarn just such a different color to begin with? Something else I thought was interesting was that the difference between 200% and 457% is not that big. It's not proportional to how many more dandelions I used. Well, this was fun. As long as I'm here, I'd like to put out a call for all of your old wool sweaters. If you're not using them anymore and you want to give them away, please, I will take them and I will love them and I will give them new life. They can be as ugly as sin, but if they are more than 80% wool, I will love to take them. I've been wanting to show off this sweater from the very beginning, but there wasn't ever really a good spot, so here it is now for all of the survivors that have made it through this video. I dyed this with goldenrod last fall. It's recycled yarn from 2 different sweaters. One used to be a really dark gray, and then this is the original color of this. Okay, that's all. I'll be done geeking out now. Yarn.